Hey there everyone, this is Samuel Johnson and welcome back to the Steven Universe Retrospectives. I apologize in advance if it looks like I'm tired or exhausted while doing this vlog. It's because I am. The week just kind of hit me like a truck before I sat down to watch these videos, and I'm exhausted. I just kind of want to lie down, and right now my fuse is a lot shorter than it is normally, so I'm kind of getting triggered very easily by like little things, so I may end up like pausing every now and again for little emergencies because I don't think you want to see me freaking out on camera. So again, apologies in advance. I'm not into it as much this week as I am other weeks, but into it I am though, because today we're going to be discussing episodes 21 and 22 of Steven Universe, Joking Victim and Steven and the Stevens. And let's start with Joking Victim. In this case, Steven gets a temp job at the Big Donut. How he got it was he got pranked by Amethyst. She gave him some fries which were laced with, I forgot what the name of the salt was. It was essentially I'm guessing it was like a magic salt. But it was a super spicy salt. I forgot what it was called. Essentially, you douse anything with it, it suddenly becomes super spicy and super hot. And well, Steven ate a bunch of the fries that Amethyst doused them with, and in his attempt to cool his mouth down, he ran to the Big Donut, wound up guzzling down a bunch of soda, which caused a bit of a mess in the Big Donut. Lars slipped in it, claimed he hurt his back, and so Sadie let him go home for the day. As such, to help Sadie out, Steven volunteered to take Lars's place for the day, and for the most part, Steven seems to be enjoying it. He likes having the day-to-day work. Sadie is grateful to have said work. He loves the training video because apparently it was a rap R&B song that Mr. Smiley did in his younger days. Pretty much just everything's going well. Steven, of course, kind of getting wrapped up in it, thinks, well, maybe I can do this more often. And Sadie even jokingly states, well, I better call Lars and say he doesn't have to come back in because I found his replacement. And when Steven takes her seriously, Sadie does say, no, he may act like a jerk sometimes, but he can be nice when you get to know him. And Steven does end up inquiring more about this, and Sadie does mention a kind of fond memory for her of a time when she and Lars did hang out, and she saw some of the good in him. Essentially, it was essentially around the time this new game came out, but the only game store that was selling it or in the area Lars was banned from, so he had Sadie go in his place, and she wound up staying in line for 7 hours just to get in this game. But when she brought it to him, they actually had a good time playing it. He became her player too, so to speak. And on top of that, he cleaned up his room for her. He even got I forgot what it was, onion clam chips. I forgot what they were, but essentially he even got her favorite snack. And ever since, Lars has referred to Sadie as his player too, which Sadie actually thinks is touching and thoughtful. As such, Steven thinks that, well, if Lars can be that touching and thoughtful, maybe we should do something nice for him since he hurt his back. As such, once the work is done, Steven and Sadie go to Lars's house with the intent of bringing him a box of donuts. Only when they arrive, they see the fish stew pizza delivery van out in front of Lars's house. At first, they think that's Lars ordered pizza, only to hear laughing in the backyard. And when Steven and Sadie go to check, they find Lars hanging out with the cool kids again. Yeah, he faked his injury, which honestly is obvious if you look at it. He over-exaggerated to the nth degree, but Sadie does take this personally because she did genuinely feel sorry for him, and in her anger and outrage, she just storms out with tears in her eyes. And apparently, this is not the first time that Lars has burned her, and so this is just kind of getting to her, and she just wants to be able to burn him back. And so Steven, hearing that, thinks, what if I think I have the perfect solution? As such, the next day, Steven comes in with a vial of that salt that Amethyst used to prank him, and the intent is to lather that salt on a donut and give it to Lars. Sadie at first doesn't want to do that because she thinks getting back at Lars will probably make her just as bad as him, but when Lars comes into the Big Donut and continuing to feign the injury, all the anger and resentment comes back to the surface, and Sadie just douses a donut with the salt. As such, she goes up to see Lars, and while he continues playing up the injured back, Eventually, she does offer him the donut, which he does happily accept. Steven, of course, thinks it's trying to suppress chuckles and laughing at the fact that Lars is just about to eat this. Only once Lars takes a bite, he starts breathing fire. Not a joke. He literally, it's just like so hot, it's actually causing him to breathe fire, and he just runs out of the big donut in pain. Sadie is, of course, absolutely shocked by this because this isn't what she wanted. She just wanted to get back at him, not put his life in danger. And so, as a result, she grabs the fire extinguisher and chases after Lars, putting out any fires that she comes across. And so as he's running, Lars passes by Amethyst, who wants to know what's going on, and Steven admits that he used some of that salt that she used on a donut and gave it to Lars. As such, Amethyst thinks it's hilarious, but Lars, hearing this, gets mad at Steven and tries going after him, only for Sadie to come in and admit that she did it because she is so sick of him constantly burning her, and how despite the fact that they shared this honestly intimate and sweet moment, to her it was something nice. To him, it seemed like nothing. Like, it's just player, and even in her own words, is player 2 just code for it could have been anybody? As such, when Lars hears this, it does kind of make him stop, and Steven manages to go in and use the Heimlich maneuver to get Lars to spit up what's left of the fiery donut. And while Sadie does use the fire extinguisher to put out all the fires, well, she's not apologizing. She takes responsibility for her actions, but she's not apologizing. She genuinely does believe that Lars deserved what he got, but Lars, rather than trying to sit with him wanting an apology, does offer his assistance in helping clean up. And so the episode ends with Steven just being proud of himself for being proud of, or Steven just kind of watching by, while Amethyst says, "Hey, we make a good team," and Steven says, "You did nothing to contribute here." But, so yeah, that's that episode. And then we get to Steven and the Stevens. This one actually involves time travel. In this episode, Steven and the Gems are in an underwater palace, searching for something called the Hourglass of Time. Essentially, it's exactly what it says on the tin. It's a mystical hourglass that gives whoever wields it the ability to travel through time. The only problem is the Aqua Temple that it's located in is filled with a bunch of replica hourglasses. Think the Holy Grail in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Essentially, only one of them is real, and if you take the wrong one, it triggers a booby trap that ends up sinking the temple and makes it inaccessible for 100 years. The Gems realize they need to be careful, but Amethyst, being Amethyst, ends up grabbing with the first one that she finds, and it once again causes the temple to sink. However, since Amethyst is so keen on keep taking hers home, Steven decides he wants a souvenir too, and earlier he had been eyeing what looked like a little hourglass in a ball, and so he takes that hourglass and he and the Gems end up porting back to Beach City, though they do get waterlogged. However, after this, Steven kind of runs off because today there is an event at Beach City called Beach-a-Palooza, and Steven and his dad are supposed to have a performance in it. As such, Steven goes to meet with his dad, and he's kind of having a bit of an incident. You see, Onion's dad, Yellowtail, tried backing in his fishing boat into Greg's car wash, and it got stuck. So it's going to be a while before they can get it unstuck. So as a result, Greg says that he might have to skip Beach-a-Palooza. Steven is upset by this, but understanding, and leaves, though he wishes he could go back in time and warn his dad to not back the boat in, which ends up causing Steven to vanish and reappear outside the car wash just as Yellowtail is backing the boat in to said car wash. Steven, of course, is confused by this for a second, but does take the opportunity to warn his dad and stop the boat from going in. As such, Steven quickly realizes that he actually has the real hourglass, and he can't wait to show Amethyst and he can't wait to show the Gems this, but unfortunately, due to Steven's meddling, it causes another disaster, as Yellowtail is insistent that the boat is big enough to fit inside the car wash. At least I assume. I don't understand a word he says. But he leaves his truck idle, and it causes the truck to back into a light pole, which causes it to fall over and not hit the car wash, and causes the whole thing to go up in flames. As such, Steven ends up going back in time again to warn his past self to not warn his dad, and so And so while both Stevens are like, oh, this, it's like, oh, thanks for, and so while both Stevens do realize the ramifications of time travel, that they can't just go around messing with it, they also suddenly realize, wait a minute, there's two of us. What if we formed a band? As such, they decide to use the timepiece to the hourglass to just form a band of Stevens as they go back in time to Steven earlier when he was on his way to meet with his dad and tell him about what happened with the boat, and then they get a fourth Steven from I don't know when. But bottom line, they end up forming a band called Steven and the Stevens, and they seem to have a good time, but strife does start to build up as each of the Stevens in one way or another is the original Steven, and so they're starting to butt heads a little. And while they do all decide to allow the leader of the band to be the Steven that's been around the longest, aka the one that had the hourglass in the beginning, they do their own little personality quirks do start getting on each other's nerves, specifically Steven 1's nerves. Yeah, they number all the other Stevens to figure out who is who. And so Steven does start lamenting, just kind of he starts realizing just the implications of having to be in a band with himself. Only problem is that with all the infighting in the band, while he's off lamenting these facts, the other Stevens took a vote and kicked the original out, forming their own band, which was supposed to be like a hard rock band. And their first song is about how that Steven hurt their feelings because he gave each of them a label, and he said he was the handsome one. And so the first Steven is actually getting upset by this, and he's seeing them all fighting, and so he decides he wishes that he could stop all this, that he could undo everything, and so he realizes, wait, I can. And as such, he pulls out his hourglass and begins going back in time. His intent is to try and warn his past self to not form the band, to just go on and warn him about what happened with Greg. But the thing is, all four Stevens have their own hourglasses, so the other Stevens actually begin following him. As such, it becomes just kind of a race through time as all four Stevens begin jumping from time period to time period to try and undo what's going on here, which does lead to some funny moments where they end up popping out back into earlier episodes like Rose's Room or maybe the first episode, but the thing is, with all the time travel going on, their numbers begin doubling. And so 4 become 8, 8 becomes 12, etc., etc. And it just keeps going. Until eventually they do manage to pop into the moment in time when Steven found the hourglass, and it's again when the underwater temple is getting flooded. And so just as the Steven at that time finds the hourglass, all the other Stevens pop in and just start fighting with the original, the one that they call Handsome Steven, just immediately looming over his past self and demanding the hourglass. Meanwhile, and what I love is that the gems are just standing on the warpad looking in absolute horror, and I love it. But as future Steven knocks over his past self and takes the original hourglass, he immediately sees his past self looking horrified while future Steven is laughing maniacally, and he sees all the violence with all the other Stevens around him, and he realizes, oh, this is bad. Oh, we've kind of gone off the deep end, haven't we? As such, he immediately yells out that all this is doing is causing trouble for everybody, and so he decides that if they really want to fix this, they need to nip it in the bud. So he takes the hourglass they took from his past self, and he smashes it. And since this hourglass is the earliest hourglass from in time, well, it causes every other version of Steven that was meant to exist after this moment, and reduces them to time dust. In other words, they all die. And it is not kind. They all just disappear one by one, and they all go out yelling. It's honest to God horrifying. And the past Steven is just looking at this going, what the hell? But future Steven tells him and does give him enough warning to tell him that Greg won't be able to play in the boat's too fat, and that he wants him to keep being cool before he eventually dies too. As such, taking his future self's advice, Steven ends up forming a band with the Crystal Gems, and they perform at Beach Palooza. And it's a song about how he's staying true to himself after he watched himself die and create an alternate timeline. So that's the thing. So yeah, what are my thoughts on the episodes? Well, first let's talk about Joking Victim. I think it's a fine episode, But it's also another example of why I dislike Lars episodes. While the initial episode, Lars and the Cool Kids, I think is actually a pretty good episode, it's also one of the thing is the lesson that Lars learned in that episode, that he doesn't need to put on a facade, that he can actually act like a decent person, be considerate of others. It's a lesson that takes him a long time to learn. And while that is true to real life, because people don't just like change on a dime, it does take time for certain lessons to sink in and take hold in someone's personality and cause some real change. For Lars, a majority of his episodes involve him having to relearn the lesson over and over as he keeps trying to fit in with the cool kids, trying to maintain an image, or act like a jerk to people who only want to be his friends. In this case, or in this particular case, Sadie. It's annoying, and a lot of his episodes really do follow this similar plot. And this episode, unfortunately, is no exception, because it's a honest-to-God dick move. It's honestly an example of kind of a toxic relationship between Sadie and Lars, because Sadie genuinely does care about Lars and his well-being. When she hears that he's hurt, she's willing to step in and take over, even though it annoys her. And ultimately, while Steven does talk about how he thinks that Lars is a kind of a jerk and that maybe he should be fired, Sadie is quick to jump to Lars's defense and say, well, he can be a nice guy when you get to know him. Which does kind of fall into line with abuse victims in some regards. As some of them are like, well, they're nice when you get to know them, or there are moments that they're nice that you don't see. But the thing is, a lot of the time, they're just manipulating their partners or significant others into thinking that is how things should be, and their partners are more than willing to do it because, hey, they're nice at times. And it's unfortunately kind of an example what we see with Lars and Sadie. Sadie is willing to cover for Lars despite him obviously faking it. It's just that when she sees him taking advantage, it's just that when catches him at home, not only relishing and having the day off from faking an injury, but hanging out with other people as if they were more important than her. Yeah, you can understand why she's so upset. After all, he keeps referring to her as his player too. They're supposed to have like this nice little important connection, right? And yet he blows her off just to go hang out with the cooler kids. That's kind of a nice little middle finger to their friendship, isn't it? And and it makes sense why Sadie is hit so hard by this, because she cares enough about him to cover his job, to take over for him, and yet he doesn't return yet when push comes to shove, he'd rather be with other people. It's a nice little punch in the gut to her feelings, and it does make you feel sorry for her and get angry at Lars. Now again, there is still some nice comeuppance by the end of the episode with the donut doused in the flaming salt. And as a result, and admittedly, while Sadie is a decent enough human being that she wants to help Lars despite what he did to her, I openly admit it's also cathartic to see him suffering. And by the end, while Sadie does take responsibility for her actions, again, she's not apologizing. He kind of deserved the comeuppance. So that's a nice little cathartic way. But I think so that's nice and cathartic, and again, it is at least nice to see the decent part of Lars come up and offer to help. But again, it's him learning the same lesson we've seen him learn before. And I assure you, the next time we see him, he's going to be learning another variation of that lesson. So, yeah, it's kind of a problem. I mean, again, now, though I will say this, as the series goes on, Lars has addressed that it does take him a while to learn this sort of stuff, but that's much later in the series, and we'll get to that when we get to that. But I think another reason why I think I'm okay with this episode is because it also examines the Lars and Sadie relationship. While this does showcase more of the negative traits of Lars, it also showcases more of his relationship to Sadie and how she is as a character. She's very reliable, very friendly. She's very outgoing, is willing to be nice to other people, and while she does have a breaking point, ultimately she is a very decent human being with a lot of patience. It's just that while that patience is bountiful, it's not limitless. And as we saw in this episode, if you push her far enough, she will snap and she'll get back. And she will get back at you. Admittedly, she doesn't want cause any major harm because again she was worried about Lars when he started literally breathing fire. But at the very least, it is nice. It is a nice, well-rounded character. She is nice. She's decent. But at the same time, fear her wrath. Cross her and invite death. It's a nice little way of show. It's a nice little character piece, and does have some legitimately good moments and good character pieces as we see Sadie and the beginnings of kind of her relationship with Lars. Because another thing, she forgives Lars a lot in the series, though it's again because of the whole sometimes he's nice thing. So yeah, that's kind of annoying too. But at the same time, Sadie is the type of person who would try and do nice things just because it's the nice thing to do. So it's a nice little bit of character for her. Though again, the negative traits of the episode do come from Lars being Lars and Sadie's patience with him. Because again, there are future episodes where their relationship is further addressed. So sorry about the shaking. My Chindy's right there, and she's standing up and jumping down. And as hold on one second. Sorry about that, like I said, Chindy. But like I said, yeah, the relationship is further addressed in later episodes, so it's a double-edged sword. Again, it's negative because again it features more of Lars and his more toxic traits of his personality, and Sadie's patience with him, because she does keep forgiving him, and yeah, she does keep getting burned in some regard. And yeah, there is a burn in a later episode that does hit harder. We'll get to that when we get to that, but otherwise, it is kind of a nice way of showcasing more of her character. Otherwise, though, there is still some fun stuff to the episode. It's nice to see Steven stepping up. The stuff with the fire donut is cathartic and funny to watch. And there's a nice little brick joke that happens in the episode that that has a noodle incident. As when Steven goes to work in the Big Donut, he sees that they get all the donuts shipped in. He asks, "Oh, you don't make them in the store?" It's like, "No, not since the accident." And the camera pans over, and there's just like this black soot outline on the wall in the outline of a person. Like, you never learn what the accident was, and I love that. It's just like, what the hell happened there, and you never find out. It's great, and I love it. So overall, it's a decent episode, but again, its more negative traits come from Lars being a jackass and having to relearn a variation of the lesson he learned before, and kind of the beginning of the relationship that he and Sadie have. So yeah, that's a thing. As for Steven and the Stevens, that one's kind of a nice bit of what the hell as well. It's a definitely fun premise of seeing Steven using the hourglass to just like jump all across time and screw with things, form a band with multiple versions of himself from throughout history, or throughout his own personal history. And it's mostly just a silly, zany, fun episode that really just kind of, the more it goes along, the more insane and crazy it gets. And honestly, I think that's what makes it so fun. Seeing Steven jumping around, trying to either change time and make things worse, or getting annoyed at his past self's own antics, and as he continues getting annoyed, seeing his mental state kind of go a little bit more downhill, until eventually it's causing he and all the other Stevens are just fighting each other and acting insane. It's honestly amusing to watch, and just kind of fun, and kind of just very odd to see, but the fun kind of odd, especially in the final scene where he goes to his earliest incarnation who found the hourglass, steals it, and is just kind of chuckling like a maniac while he has a crazed look in his eyes. It's honestly kind of funny, and and the ending is just such a dark ending. Seeing future Steven realize just how much damage that he's caused by constantly jumping through time and interacting with his past selves, and realizing that if he wants to end this, he has to destroy the hourglass. It's such a dark ending, because, yeah, they all die. The Steven that we were following throughout the whole episode dies at the end. And the Steven we are left with is a version of Steven who, from his perspective, went to the underwater temple, grabbed this little bauble, and then just saw a bunch of future versions of himself fighting and hurting each other until one version smashed the thing he was going to take, and then they all die. That's kind of horrifying. And what I find hilarious is that they just kind of brush it off. Like at the end, Steven just takes his future self's advice to heart, forms a band with the Crystal Gems, and the song is such an upbeat song about how he has to stay true to himself after he created an alternate timeline and watched his future selves die. Like, what the hell? Just like, what the frack am I watching here? It's such a dark story, but it's treated so light and so and has so much zany, silly moments with the Stevens jumping through time, making things worse, and interacting with one another. It's just so weird and crazy, but you can't help but love it. And it's just and as a result, the episode is just a big giant "what the fuck am I watching" episode, and I kind of love it for that. So overall, I had a good time. Choking Victim again was all right. Definitely had its flaws with Lars and the Sadie and the beginnings of his and Sadie's relationship, but overall I think was entertaining enough. And the Steven and the Stevenson episode was just batshit insane, and I loved it for that. So overall, good time. Overall, it was a good time. One was all right. One was fun. So yeah, I think this was a good time. So yeah, that's about it. Thank you for watching. I'm Samuel Johnson, and I'll see you next week. Take care.